a joy to welcome members, students, and newcomers on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. We remind you to visit our website to find out about upcoming programs and secure your spot in Bill Browder's conversation about how he became Putin's most wanted man, and Richard Haas' dialogue on global issues and his new book, The World, A Brief Introduction. Tonight's program will be moderated by Basma Gari, our program's director who is taking a new path in her life and is closing the WAC chapter this week. We will miss you and are grateful for all of the work you did at the council. We're honored to have Milan Vaishnav, who is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His primary research focus is the political economy of India, and he studies issues such as corruption and governance, state capacity, distributive politics, and electoral behavior. He is also the author of When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, which was awarded Best Nonfiction Book on Contemporary India, published in 2017. Milan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Veridiana. Milan, I want to start our conversation discussing India's leadership. Prime Minister Modi has been promoting what seem like increasingly authoritarian policies. Could you discuss his agenda in terms of governance and India's standing as a democracy?
First of all, let me thank you for inviting me. As a native Houstonian, it's always fun to do things with the Houston World Affairs Council, and it's particularly special, Basma, given that this is your last event.
Yes, it is.
So I was telling you before the show, we'll have to make it a good one, so I hope I can live up to that. You know, I think there are a lot of people who have been commenting about India's democratic distress. And I think those commentators have focused principally on three issues. You know, under the tenure of this particular Prime Minister, Prime Minister Modi, India appears to have moved decisively in a more majoritarian or pro-Hindu direction, particularly since the start of Modi's second term in May 2019.
Right.
In addition to this kind of pro-Hindu outlook, I think Modi has centralized power, probably not to an extent that we've seen since the prime ministership of Indira Gandhi, which was more than 3 decades ago. He oversees the most powerful prime minister's office, PMO, of any prime minister in recent memory. And so he's consolidated a huge amount of authority, both within the government as well as within the BJP, his political party. Finally, I think that the Modi government has sort of demonstrated, I think you could say contempt is maybe a good word for it, for dissent. It sought to paint critics of the government as anti-national. And so I think when we talk about illiberal tendencies or authoritarian tendencies, I think these are the things that we're sort of talking about. Now, to get to the second part of your question, what are Modi's goals? You know, we hear a lot about making America great again in this country. You know, I think Modi has a version of that, which is reclaiming Indian greatness. And I use the word reclaiming deliberately. You know, this is not for the prime minister, I think, about creating something new. It's about going back to something which used to exist, but which was lost. You know, a lot of people in the BJP talk about, prior to independence, India having to suffer through a period of, 1,200 years of servitude under foreign rulers, whether it was the British Raj, the Mughals, the Turks, and so on and so forth. And so what are the elements of reclaiming Indian greatness for Prime Minister Modi? I think there are probably three, and I'm happy to discuss each of these in greater detail. But I think one is that on the foreign policy stage, Modi believes India should be a leading power rather than a balancing power. So it's not just about India being a hedge or a check against China. It's actually being a global power in its own right. India doesn't want to be seen as a pawn in kind of somebody else's global game. I think the second is that economic upliftment, economic modernity is a central pillar of this reclaiming greatness. You know, Modi has repeatedly talked pre-COVID, obviously things look very different now, about India becoming a $5 trillion economy by the year 2024, which would be the end of his second term. And I think the third aspect is kind of building a strong, decisive, muscular leadership at home that is in sync with India's Hindu cultural ethos. I think, Modi's view is that this is a country that's 80% Hindu. And so therefore its leadership, its government, its values, its society, its culture should reflect essentially, what is the majority view.
And how is the Indian population responding to his governance?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think, look, there is no doubt that Modi is extremely popular. I mean, he is the most popular politician in India by, a long shot. Some polls show, despite the fact that India is really struggling with dealing with the coronavirus, that Modi's grown even more popular. Now, when you try to dissect the elements of his popularity, I think this popularity is due to three factors. One is that he is incredibly charismatic. The way I like to describe it is, if you think about somebody who has the oratorical skills of a Barack Obama and the retail political skills of a Bill Clinton, Modi combines both of these. That's extremely rare in any country. The second is that Modi is viewed as incorruptible, right? He's not someone who's personally rich. He has no descendants. He has no family to make money for. And so he's seen as somebody who can kind of stay above the fray. And the third thing is that, people believe that whatever you might say about him, whatever mistakes he might make in terms of policy, that he keeps the national interest in mind. So he's in touch with the common man in a way that I think is very new and refreshing for a lot of Indians. Now, that's the kind of pro-Modi side of it. I think there is another side, and it would be remiss if we didn't talk about that, which is the complete failure of the opposition, right? I mean, a lot of Indians just don't believe that the Congress Party, which is the BJP's principal rival, has what it takes to lead the country. And most importantly, the leadership of the Congress Party, which is a dynastic party led by the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, they don't have what it takes. So, I think we shouldn't get too carried away with ourselves in terms of the BJP support. I mean, if you look at the 2019 election, the BJP got around 37.5% of the all India vote. Right. So the country is very polarized, much like our own country. It's a situation where positions are black and white rather than, there's very little room for nuance or shades of gray, and people are pretty dug in. But at the present moment, given Modi's charisma and his strengths and the opposition's weaknesses, it's really hard to see any other leader going, again, head-to-head, toe-to-toe with Modi on a national scale, right? They can do it in particular states, but not nationwide.
Thank you, Milan. And you just touched on this, comparing India to America, but perhaps you could expand. What does Prime Minister Modi's relationship with President Trump imply in terms of political policies and agendas for both countries? In other words, does their close relationship say anything about the similarities in their political views and goals?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think superficially, a lot of people see similarities between Modi and Trump, right? They both fit in this kind of idea we have of kind of populist leaders, prime ministers and presidents. They talk a lot about, their country first, America first, India first. They have a huge distrust for mainstream media. Second to Donald Trump, Narendra Modi has the largest social media following of any world leader. Over 45 million Twitter followers, I think at last count. So superficially, I think there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences too. And I don't think we think about those enough. I mean, Modi was an experienced politician for many, many years. I mean, he ran the state of Gujarat, which is a prosperous and populous Northwest Indian state, for more than a dozen years. He was not somebody who came from the world of reality TV or real estate like Donald Trump did. Right. But he never was seen as a creature of Delhi. We talk about life inside the Beltway in Washington. There's a similar kind of Beltway in Delhi, and Modi was outside of that. So he was able, even though he was a political operative, to kind of portray himself in contrast to the usual sorts of politicians. When it comes to their personal rapport, I don't think that it's particularly special. Narendra Modi and Barack Obama had what a lot of people said was a pretty good one-to-one personal relationship. It surprised a lot of people because they also have very different outlooks. I think there is a lot of skepticism, a lot of uncertainty in New Delhi about President Trump, about his intentions. He has positioned himself at times as a friend of India, but then we saw just during the COVID period in the early days, when there was this anti-malarial drug, hydroxychloroquine, that the United States wanted, and India was threatening maybe not to export it. He said that he would maybe sanction India or take decisive punitive action. And so I think they're very cautious. And I think broadly Trump hasn't been so bad for India. But I wouldn't say he's been so great for India either, right? I mean, I think it's sort of, you have to break down issue by issue.
Thank you. And I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. Recently, we have been seeing nationalistic moves that raise questions of India's regional plans, such as revoking the special status of Kashmir and the recent Citizenship Amendment Act, which might be perceived as an act of Hindu nationalism. Could you comment on why India implemented these and what its larger geopolitical agenda might be?
Well, I think it's a big question, right? I think you have to step back to the independence period, the 1940s. There was a secular, syncretic vision that nationalist leaders at the time possessed. So these are leaders like Nehru, Ambedkar, Mahatma Gandhi, which embraced the notion of unity and diversity, that India was this unprecedentedly diverse place, and it could only coexist and under a democratic roof if it kind of embraced that diversity. Mm-hmm. And so they advocated for all sorts of things that were in keeping with this view. So constitutional protections for minority faiths, special status for a state like Jammu and Kashmir, which was India's only Muslim majority state. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there was a second view, an alternative view of Hindu nationalism, who felt that, look, Indian culture should be synonymous with the culture of Hindus, because again, going back to what I said earlier, they account for 80% of the population. Now, because the secularist view won that debate, it's easy to forget that there was this alternative view, and that alternative view may have been defeated, but it never entirely went away. And I think what the BJP represents is a resurgence of that view. And I think that resurgence is part because the secular view is viewed as having failed. That although the Congress Party, which espoused secularism, tried to advocate for that position, they cynically used religion, what people call minority appeasement or vote bank politics, when it suited them. And so because that other vision had kind of collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, I think Hindu nationalism has come to the fore. And so, here we are, Narendra Modi won a resounding re-election in 2019, and I think finally feels that he has the political capital to start to implement some of the things the BJP has long advocated for. Some of the things you mentioned, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which creates expedited citizenship for non-Muslim refugees who want to seek a home in India, the changing of Jammu and Kashmir's constitutional autonomy, the creation of a Hindu temple at the Babri Masjid site in the disputed site of Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh. These are all things which have long been on BJP manifestos, but you now have a government which sees it has the political opening and the popular backing to legislate some of these things. So, it shouldn't come as a surprise, I think, to people who are watching India, because these are, again, things that the BJP has long advocated for. Now, that doesn't mean they're not controversial or that they don't go against the constitutional ethos. I think many people, including myself, would argue that many of these acts do. But this is part of a coherent worldview that the BJP espouses.
Thank you. And moving on to India's human rights issues, India has gained much attention over the past decade regarding humanitarian violence. In the spotlight have been religious and political violence and violence against women especially. Could you give an update on current significant human rights issues and how the governing administration is addressing them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to minimize human rights issues that exist in the country, but I can't focus on them all. So let me just pick three I think are probably the most prominent in the year 2020 where we are now. I think the first is we are seeing incredible police brutality, much as we see are grappling with in this country. Our our viewers should remember that the police in India are essentially a colonial era apparatus. The police today in 2020 are still governed by the Police Act of 1861, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a police force meant to subjugate the population, not to act as a community policing force to provide law and order. It is a force that is incredibly politicized. There is a reason why many state chief ministers, who are the equivalent to our governors, they choose not to give the home ministry portfolio to somebody else. They want to retain it because the home ministry oversees the police and the security forces. They deal in impossible working conditions. Most police work 14 hours a day. About 50% of police officers work 7 days a week. And so it's a combustible mix of a colonial orientation, impossible working conditions, politicization, poor pay, poor facilities. And so the police are often viewed as an oppressor rather than an ally. And I think that in the cases of police violence we've seen recently, they kind of illustrate that point. There are two other categories of human rights violations, I think, are human rights indignities. One is anti-minority violence, primarily violence against Muslims and violence against Dalits, or what were, India's scheduled caste, the group that was formerly known as untouchables. This is the group that sits at the kind of bottom rung of the Hindu caste hierarchy. I think when it comes to Muslims, given the BJP is in power and that kind of pro-Hindu or majoritarian voices and politicians have been enabled, we have seen a lot of anti-Muslim violence, essentially people engaging in that violence with impunity. And there's an enabling environment that may not necessarily condone it, but might look the other way. Dalits is a more interesting question because the Hindutva movement has often been at odds with Dalits because they have a very Brahminical upper caste view of Hinduism, which reinforces some of the cleavages of the caste system. Modi is trying to change that. And in fact, successive BJP leaders have tried to have a more inclusive view that erases caste divisions because they see huge political and social opportunity in breaking down caste divisions. Now, there's a fight within the BJP, within the movement. I don't want to minimize anti-Dalit violence, but I do think that there's an ongoing debate about the role that lower caste and Dalits play in Indian society. The last thing I'll just mention is violence against women. Now, this is something that's endemic. It's not new. It could be exacerbated by COVID because we have seen an uptick, at least anecdotally, in reports of domestic abuse. India has one of the world's most skewed sex ratios in terms of the number of women per men. It's something on the order of 930 or 40 women per every 1,000 men. And there's a paradox at work here because, women have become politically incredibly empowered. If you look at just turning out to vote, civic participation in the past several decades, but economically, they have not been empowered. Female labor force participation in India is not only low worldwide, but it's actually going down rather than going up. So I think these are the kind of three major, challenges. Just very quickly on what's been done, I think on police, next to nothing. No politician has championed police reform. They don't view it in their political interest. The police force you see today looks very similar to the one that we've seen for the past 7 decades. On anti-minority violence, again, I think we have seen more of a groundswell pre-COVID to deal with issues of minority rights. Those have now moved off of the political agenda because everyone is focused on the pandemic. But I suspect that once the pandemic dies down, we're going to see those issues come back to the fore. I think on women, it's a mixed picture. I think the central government has rolled out schemes to try to educate ordinary Indians about gender violence, about violence against women, about equal opportunity. This prime minister has spoken out a lot about it. The verdict, I think the jury is still out. I think one of the struggles in India is that it's a federal country and states do things very differently. And so in one state, their gender policing may have worked, cultural gender sensitivity classes may have worked, but we haven't yet developed a macro picture, I think, of what works and what doesn't. And I think one of the things that we are really missing from this government, and it'd be nice to see, is a way to really aggregate lessons from the states And that's a role that the center could play in helping essentially to improve policy.
Thank you, Milan. And talking about India's economy now, India's economy is slowing down. It kicked off 2020 with a pretty weak quarter. And of course, the coronavirus pandemic slowed down economic activity even more. Could you discuss why India is experiencing an economic slowdown overall and its key economic challenges for the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously COVID is having devastating economic impacts. I mean, the projections we're seeing are serious, significant negative growth, maybe on the order of, negative 5% GDP growth for the fiscal year. But even before COVID, India was in the midst of a pretty pronounced and pretty protracted economic slowdown, a 3-year economic slowdown. So we saw subdued investment, we saw weak anemic growth, we saw sluggish exports. Exports have been a driver of growth in India historically. We saw a banking system that was laden with a lot of distressed assets. So I think if you try to form a diagnosis of what's happened, India had the boom years in the 2000s when it was growing at almost Chinese level growth rates. A lot of that growth was fueled by easy credit, pretty favorable global conditions. Those conditions bottomed out. They no longer exist. And the effects of living high on the hog in the good times have kind of come home to roost. So a lot of bets were made, a lot of loans were given that were not based on sound business acumen. And so you have companies that took on too much debt, so they can't invest. You have public sector banks, over 2/3 of the banking system is owned by the public sector, who can't make new loans. And so these two things come together and they act as a vice on the economy. So economists have called this the twin balance sheet problem. Private sector's balance sheets are wrecked, and so is the public sector in terms of lending. You've had, in addition to this, shadow banks come up. So these are things called non-banking financial NBFCs come up, which have essentially done things like auto loans, home loans, mortgages. Those also were a bit dubious. They were kind of in a regulatory black hole. So those have also, a lot of those have gone belly up. And so that's really creating a lot of pressure on the supply side. On the demand side, on the consumer economy, you had a bunch of policy shocks. So you've had the goods and services tax, which has had a very problematic, uneven rollout. You had demonetization, which was this economic shock, which sucked a lot of liquidity out of the economy in 2016. And now you have COVID, right? So both on the supply and demand side, you have major issues. Where do we go from here? I think the government is going to have to deal with kind of 3 things simultaneously. The first thing is it's going to have to invest in a safety net, right? I mean, this is a situation where people are starving. People don't have access to food. They don't have access to basic, to employment. You are going to have to invest in those safety nets, and you may even have to consider some kind of universal basic income or guaranteed supplement so that people have a floor that they can live on. I think you're going to have to take some pretty drastic steps on the banks. That may include something like we, contemplated in 2008 in the United States, creating a bad bank, right? You take all these toxic assets and the government backs those up. But the fiscal situation is really in a mess in India. I mean, the true fiscal deficit of the country, if you look at the state and the center, is like 10% of GDP. That's extremely high. Wow. And so I think they're going to have to make some tough choices. So, things like disinvestment, privatization, selling government assets, you're going to have to free up some room in order to spend and stimulate the economy. And so these are decisions the government has kind of kicked that can down the road. But that time to kick those, that runway to kick things down the road, I think, is coming to an end.
Right. And how are India's bilateral relations impacting its economy, especially as China's presence grows stronger and significant countries in the region, such as Russia and Pakistan, are following China's lead?
Well, we're seeing an increased period of tensions between India and China. Right now there are a series of border disputes playing out,
Mhm.
and there are high-level talks between the Indian and Chinese militaries to try to resolve those. A lot of people see this as part of a broader Chinese power grab. Things like we've seen in the South China Sea, we've seen in other parts of South Asia. This is of a piece with those. The government is trying to downplay these incursions. And I think that's because they realize that China remains, whatever geostrategic defense problems we have with China, India is going to have to trade with China. It's going to require Chinese investment. And so they are acting in a concerted way to try to de-escalate tensions. That's very different from what you see on the nightly news in India. It's very different from what you see in popular opinion. It's very different from what you see in the newspapers. I think India is very internally divided in terms of the official, in terms of the government position, and in terms of trade. I think you see some people wanting to double down on a more protectionist stance. And so there was a giant trade deal called RCEP, which was a Chinese-led trade deal, which involves a lot of the countries of East and Southeast Asia. India was a part of those negotiations at the 11th hour. It has backed out. Is no longer part of that free trade deal. But you see others who say, look, we don't need to be more protectionist. We need to actually be out there trying to integrate into global supply chains. So I think when you think about bilateral relations, India is seeking partnerships with other countries like the United States, who are also very wary about Chinese expansionism. China has overseen this thing called the Belt and Road Initiative, which has an economic component, has a defense component, has a diplomatic component, and India has been leading the pack in terms of saying, we don't want to join this, and we are willing to work with countries like Australia, like New Zealand, like the United States, like Japan, and others who are similarly skeptical. So I think that emphasis on this Indo-Pacific region and countries who see things differently is where India is going to double down. But it doesn't have the luxury to alienate China completely, because it has a very real trading relationship, investment relationship, and border issue that it can't afford to blow up into a hot war.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, before we open it up to audience questions, you've gone through some of these, but perhaps you could sum up for us. What do you think are key goals necessary for India to strengthen its political economy?
Yeah, I mean, if you kind of step back and think about the big picture, I think, first and foremost, India needs to invest in building and strengthening its state capacity to provide basic public goods, right? So these are core things that we expect sovereign states to do around the world, right? So provide basic health and education, social safety net, to collect taxes, to guarantee law and order, to adjudicate disputes, right? Have a functioning rule of law court system, protect the environment. These are things that governments have to do, right? Private actors, by and large, can play a role, but the government has to be the core provider, or at least provide the enabling environment. So I think that's one thing India hasn't done very well, to be honest, over the past 70 years. The second is that, the cliche about India is that it's a highly entrepreneurial country, and I think that's true. I think this stereotype is absolutely correct. And that's a real boon, a real asset for India. And so I think the government has to get out of the way most of the time. They have to reduce barriers to entrepreneurship, and they have to allow companies to scale up. There has been this ideology in India that small is good. And so as a result, India is one of those countries that's never seen manufacturing really take off. It's the rare example you can think of of a country, maybe the only example, that's tried to industrialize or modernize, by going from agriculture to services, completely skipping over industry. And that is unlikely to provide enough jobs to fulfill, what is a growing and expanding labor force. I think the third thing I would say is that this comes back to something we spoke about earlier. India is a federal country, and you can get a lot of traction, I think, by treating the states as essentially laboratories for reform. And so I think Modi, as a former chief minister, someone who's run a state, who understands how states work, has an opportunity to say, okay, pushing federal policy in Delhi is really hard because there's not a lot of political consensus. But where the BJP is in power at the state level, the BJP can agree as a coalition of BJP states that we are going to take the following business-friendly, consumer-friendly, social policy-friendly steps and roll those out and essentially lead by example. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a kind of competitive federalism where other states are going to say, look, if we don't adopt policies X, Y, and Z, we're going to be left behind. And I think that's a different model from top-down change, but I think given how large and complex Indian society is, you have to do both. And I think we've seen a relative underemphasis on the latter.
Thank you very much, Milan. Let's move on to the audience Q&A portion. Again, to those watching, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit a question. First question, Milan, could you discuss the migrant crisis in India that has resulted from millions of jobs lost due to the coronavirus lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, this, I think, is one of the saddest aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. India has tens of millions of internal migrants. We don't have an official number. The government estimate is between 40 and 50 million. Most people think it's probably twice as big, maybe as many as 100 million. They are, a large section of these are circular migrants. These are people who come from poor, more rural states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and they go to places like Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, Hyderabad, Bangalore. They often live at the periphery of society. They really struggle to make ends meet, but this is one mechanism of social mobility, and importantly, it's a big provider of remittances of cash to send the families back home, and can create a kind of upward movement in terms of socioeconomic status. When the lockdown was announced, millions of these migrants streamed home, and I think the government was on the back foot, and they didn't expect this kind of movement. To critique the government, I think that they got a couple of things wrong. I don't think that it was wise to announce a nationwide lockdown on 4 hours' notice. I think that created an unnecessary sense of panic. When Prime Minister Modi hit the airwaves to announce the lockdown, he did not in the same breath talk about what services, what essential services would remain open, what provisions would be made for the less well-off. That came later, and I think oftentimes, the fine print gets missed, right? And so a lot of people started to panic. And the government didn't have a formulated policy on this. So at first, they restricted migrants from going back. Then they said, okay, you can. Then they said, no, you can't. Then they said, well, it's really the state's responsibility. And so it's a bit ironic because this government intellectually actually has devoted more attention to internal migration than most other governments have. But there was a disconnect, I think, between the intellectual arms of the government and what the leadership was doing. Clearly, the left hand wasn't talking to the right hand. And so I think the most important thing now is to make sure that now that so many migrants have gone home, that they are properly cared for. India is sitting on record amounts of food stocks, public food stocks. I think they should be made open and available. India has something called a public distribution system, which provides subsidized food to the less well-off. I think, frankly, that should be made open to anyone who needs food. Usually you have to go with a ration card or some sort of identification. I think we're in an unprecedented situation where we should err on the side of including too many people as opposed to excluding those who need it because they don't have identification. And I think there are things you can do. India has something called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which guarantees 100 days of labor to any person in a rural area that wants it. I think that is the nice thing about that program. It's demand driven. You only avail of that program if you need it, right? If you don't want to break your back working in the sun to get 100 rupees or 200 rupees, you're not going to do it. So only people who really are going to want that money are going to come forward. And I think that's actually It's not a program that was popular with this government because it's a Congress scheme, but it's something that allows you to really get to the grassroots. So I think there are these 2 or 3 ideas. I think lots of people have raised them. I think the government would be wise to adopt them and at least stop the short-term pain that these migrants are experiencing as you are then trying to build confidence in migrants to come back to work sites and so on and so forth. In the short term, that's going to be hard because India's COVID crisis has not peaked, and epidemiologists don't expect it to peak until late July. So, getting people to come back to work, I think, is going to be hard. So you're going to have to deal with some kind of short-term insurance or buffer mechanism.
Thank you, Milan. A question from Joel. From what I understand, one of the biggest problems in India is that the state governments have a lot of power in decision-making, and the prime minister cannot make decisions for the states. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so India has a unique constitution in terms of how federalism is kind of set up. In the constitution, there are three lists. There are things that central government has jurisdiction over, foreign affairs, defense. There are things that the state governments have jurisdiction over, things like land, things like health and education. Then there are things that are on the concurrent list. So these are things that both the center and the state can legislate on. So labor is one of those things. You have central labor laws and you have state labor laws. Now, what you need to try to do, obviously, is move on multiple levels, right? So if you take an issue like labor law reform, in India, it is very hard to pass central labor law reform because labor unions are very strong. So if you want to make it easier for companies to hire and fire workers, very hard to push a bill through parliament. But in states where they're controlled by one party, like the BJP or the Congress, those state governments can change state labor laws. What the center needs to do is allow states to experiment. And to give the BJP and the Modi government credit, they have been more willing to do that than previous governments have. I think where we need to move to probably over time is a place where you gradually reduce the number of things on the concurrent list and you beef up the things that states can do. Because I think you have to allow for some degree of autonomy and experimentation. You know, the situation in Kerala today is very, very different from the state of Uttar Pradesh. And to insist that there's a kind of one-size-fits-all policy is probably going to end up in not very good policy and a lot of unrest. And so, you know, I think that you have to strike this balance between kind of order and uniformity and allowing for bottom-up creativity and innovation to take place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Milan. And a question from Sean, I think she's talking about kind of the younger population in India. Are students in India similar to the Gen Zers here in terms of activism? And if so, what platforms are they most passionate about?
So it's a great question. It's not something we have a lot of data on, but we are seeing an interesting shift. Young voters in India have typically not come out to vote in numbers as significant as the rest of the population, as their older compatriots. That's true of the United States as well, right? A lot of college kids, for instance, choose not to vote. What's been so interesting about the period post-2014 is that young voters are voting at rates higher than the national average. By and large, they're also voting for the BJP, and they are disproportionately supportive of Prime Minister Modi. And so that is a new group of people that is, I think, politically engaged and politically active. And they get a lot of their information, unsurprisingly, from social media. So WhatsApp in India is the dominant form of information dissemination. More so, I would say, than probably email, internet, television, newspapers. It's ubiquitous, right? Because the mobile phone now has become pretty ubiquitous. That's the good news, is that that's empowered a lot of people. The bad news is it's also allowed for a lot of fake news and misinformation to proliferate unchecked, because WhatsApp is a peer-to-peer communication with no regulation, essentially. In terms of policies that you see a lot of young people engaged and active about, a lot of the protests we have seen about minority rights, about secularism, about democracy, if you look out at the faces of people leading the protests, they have been young people. They have been the most passionate advocates for human rights, for civil rights, for equal rights. We've also seen a tremendous amount of activism around LGBT issues. You know, until recently, homosexuality was essentially outlawed in India under something known as Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. The Supreme Court finally overruled that, but it was in part because of activism that we were seeing from young people. And so, you know, I think there's a bit of a paradoxical quality about India's youth, in that, and on the one hand, they are very supportive of the Prime Minister and the BJP's agenda, but they are also the leading vanguard of the movement against the BJP and the Prime Minister. So there's not a uniform view, and I think you wouldn't expect one in a country as diverse and as messy as India is.
And a question from Elizabeth: do you think the invasion of Hyderabad in 1948 provides the BJP model for the future of Jammu and Kashmir? She's wondering if you see any parallels.
You know, I haven't thought about that. I mean, obviously, the situation is somewhat different because Jammu and Kashmir is a border region, right? As opposed to Hyderabad, which was surrounded on all sides by India, essentially, even though it was claimed by Pakistan around the time of independence. You know, I think when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir, I mean, we're going to debate the status of that territory and India's move for many, many years to come. I think the move was essentially an effort to say, we are not necessarily changing the status quo in terms of the international border, but we want to reorganize the state to do two things. One is to separate Ladakh from J&K, which was a longstanding demand of the people in Ladakh, to give it greater emphasis than it's usually gotten, because it's always been swamped by J&K. The second was to give the central government more control over Jammu and Kashmir, to get the law and order situation under control. But obviously, this also has a political tinge, because the BJP views this as a way for them to gain ground. I think what was problematic about this move, whether you agree with Article 370 or not, is the way in which it was done. There was never any voice of Jammu and Kashmir in the debate to undo Article 370. Not only was the state put under a complete information blackout, but you also saw the entire local political leadership put under house arrest. In fact, some of those leaders are still under house arrest. And to do so on the grounds that, well, they're corrupt, they don't really represent the people, I think is spurious. I mean, you could make the same case about the leaders of half a dozen other Indian states to say, well, they're corrupt too, why don't we put them under house arrest? So I think that decision is going to leave a scar that this kind of central control is simply not equipped to solve.
Thanks, Milan. And we'll do one more question for the sake of time. So lastly, a question from Paresh. Are we entering the early hours of a new Cold War with China? How can India, the democratic anchor in the Indo-Pacific, play a pivotal role in this context? What opportunities should a potential Biden administration prioritize in the Indo-US partnership?
So I do think it's been a wake-up call moment. I don't know if it's the start of a new Cold War, but I think we have seen in the past several years an increasing strategic convergence between India and the United States when it comes to China and the Asia Pacific. India has always been willing to talk in the abstract about things like, the peaceful resolution of disputes, about freedom of navigation. They were never willing to put it in the context of a specific geography, and now they are. And I think that the moves China is making in the Indo-Pacific on the border, with respect to everything from technology to human rights, has strengthened those voices in India who want to make sure that India is a model in contrast to China rather than a replica. Now, I think you have to have two different discussions here. I think there's a security discussion where I think we've seen a lot of strides. I think we've seen India become more incorporated into the Asia security architecture that aligns it with the US, Australia, Japan, and other democracies. We've seen greater military to military cooperation, greater diplomatic cooperation. The place where we have not seen movement, and this is the other conversation we need to have, is really in the economic realm. A lot of people say, look, this is the opportunity for India to enter into global supply chains because firms want to leave China. Now, India had an opportunity to do that several years ago as the rising cost of labor, as the cost of labor increased in China. But firms didn't come to India. They came to Vietnam, they came to Bangladesh, they came to Thailand. Now we're seeing a second wave. And unfortunately, economists that I spoke to in India are not particularly optimistic India will be able to take advantage of those opportunities because India doesn't have the supporting policy environment in place. It doesn't have the labor policies, it doesn't have the land policies, it doesn't have the infrastructure, it doesn't have the in some cases, law and order or ease of doing business, investment climate possibilities. So by all means, India should try to exploit this opportunity and take advantage and try to insert itself. But right now, if you look at the bulk of firms which are deciding to get up and move, they are not coming to India. And I think that is where this call for increasing protectionism, I think really we have to see more pushback against it, because I do think that given the size of India's population, the youthfulness of its population, the growth in its labor force, turning inward is not going to be a recipe for success. So just to conclude, I think big opportunity that's being exploited in the security realm, but not so much, and the diplomatic realm, but not so much in the economic realm yet.
Thank you, Milan. That will be the end of our Q&A session and our program tonight. Milan, thank you again very much for your time and for sharing your input with us.
Thanks for having me. It's always good to talk to fellow Houstonians. I'm sorry that it was virtual, not in person, but thanks for having me, and congratulations on your last event, and best of luck to you in your next chapter.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll host you in Houston soon. And to those of you watching, I hope you enjoyed the program. And if you did, subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can access additional conversations. Just a reminder, we will be hosting Bill Browder on June 18th and Richard Haas next month. Please go to our website to register. Lastly, I just want to say it has been a pleasure to get to know all of you members, and a pleasure to serve you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.